Welcome to our next video, which will provide some helpful background information about the Book of Esther, which reminds the reader what it looks like to be faithful in a pagan world where God feels absent and even uncaring. This is part of a Bible reading plan with Anthem Church, and today's video is from a discussion that I led a few years ago and is edited to provide you with the essential content to help you better understand what is going on in these foundational chapters. So let's get started.
So we move from provision with Daniel, how God provides and Daniel's prosperous, to now we see this amazing protection through Esther, which is really significant for us to understand, because it wasn't just that in the story of Esther that there was opposition to God's people, is he wanted to remove the Jews from the face of the earth. And so this is a really significant protection that God provided through Esther. And so let's fast forward 100 years. So Daniel was at the beginning of the exile, right when Nebuchadnezzar came in, took away some of the best. Now we fast forward 100 years into the next world power. The Babylonian exile of Israel becomes part of the Persian Empire. And so some Jews at this point in the story of Esther, some Jews have returned to Jerusalem, like Ezra and Nehemiah, that we're going to read about next, but many have not. And so we're going to learn from the community of Jews living in exile in Persia through the story of Esther. And so there's four characters developed. We got Uncle Mordechai, his niece Esther, who becomes queen, the king of Persia, and then Haman, the Persian official and villain. He's really the antagonist of this story. So we first read about the background. The king of Persia hosts an elaborate feast to display his greatness, and in a drunken response demands his wife to show off at the party. We don't know exactly what, but it was going to be humiliating. And so he deposes her for refusing him. He hosts a beauty pageant to find a new wife. And of all the people in the known world, he chooses Esther to become queen, which we're going to start to see like these coincidences that happen. This book, God's not directly named. However, you see God's fingerprints throughout the story. And so serendipitously, Mordecai hears two royal guards plotting to murder the king. So he informs the king through Esther, and he gets credit for saving his life. Now, the king is unaware of this. We're going to learn that later. But it's an important part of kind of the backdrop of this story. And then Haman the Agagite. Now, who's an Agagite? They're a descendant of the Canaanites and is an enemy of Israel. So if you remember, King Saul was to remove them, and he refused not to. And so this was the people that came out of that. And so the Canaanites were an enemy of Israel, and Haman is elevated to the highest position in the kingdom. So this is kind of the backdrop. You have this coincidence that Esther is the new queen, this moment where Mordecai quietly saves the king, and then Haman is elevated to the highest position, and he's part of the group that were against the Jews. And so now we come to the inciting incident and the rising action in the story. Haman demands all men to kneel, and Mordecai refuses. And so Mordecai is really this kind of Daniel figure, standing for what's true. And Haman persuades the king to enact a decree to kill all the Jews. And so they celebrate together. Now, Mordecai believes that Esther became queen in that famous phrase, for such a time as this. This is the moment that God has been working to provide the protection that's needed. And so he believes that Esther is queen so that Israel becomes delivered. And so he goes to Esther to ask for her help. She responds that she's willing to do this, even if it means she will die. It's that phrase, if I perish, I perish, that if this is the end of my life, she's willing to do it. And so what does Esther do? Well, she hosts a banquet with the king and Haman, inviting them to another banquet for her to make a request of them. Haman leaves drunk. He sees Mordecai in the street. He plans for him to die by a stake the next morning. So think of that. The next morning, Mordecai is going to die. All seems lost until kind of the turn of the story. And this is what you see God's hand behind the scenes. He's not directly mentioned but you see his fingerprints. The king cannot sleep. So what does he do? He reads the royal chronicles and happens to read about the time that Mordechai saved him that we learned about in the earlier first chapter. The next morning when Haman is supposed to die, or when Mordecai is supposed to die, the next morning, Haman comes to request Mordecai's execution, and the king decrees to honor Mordecai's life, even requiring Haman to praise him. So you just see some of the humor in this. And so then at this second banquet, it gets worse for Haman. Esther informs the king that she is Jewish, and Haman has enacted a decree to kill her, and the man who saved her, saved him, Mordecai. And so the king is furious, executes Haman, and creates a second decree requiring the Jews to defend themselves. So the king can't take away that first decree, but he can add to it. So he gives the permission for the Jews to defend themselves. Since the king can't nullify the previous decree, Mordecai is elevated to the highest position. He takes over Haman's position. Haman's family is destroyed, and those who oppose the Jews, which results in a new celebration commemorating the Jews' deliverance with a feast called Purim. Now, the story of Esther is filled with ironic reversals and a lot of morally ambiguous characters. There's a lot of drinking, there's sex, there's murder, which Mordecai and Esther are apart. Even so, they are both clear examples of trusting God when life gets hard and complicated. Furthermore, God is not mentioned in this story, so he feels absent, much like what the people in exile felt as well. And so this story invites us to see how God works in the real mess of our world and even uses morally corrupt people to accomplish his purpose.